Okay. I want to get through Lacan, and then we'll touch on Zizek, and then we'll get to the final points that we discussed. So I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly because we've said so much already about it. But okay. So Lacan was always talking about death drive, of course, but he didn't really focus on it until Seminar 7. And Seminar 7 is one of his big four, one of the big four. And by that I mean there's 4 seminars of his that really are considered the 4 most important, the most significant. And it's Seminar 7, which is called The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Then there's Seminar 11, which is probably the most famous and most significant of them all. And it's the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. It's that important because he's going back to basics. He's dealing with the 4 core concepts. And then there's Seminar 17, and that one's really important because that's where he works out his theory of the 4 discourses. And maybe sometime we'll do a talk on that in the future. That would be fun. And then Seminar 20, which is all about sexuation and different types of jouissance and everything. But that's where he talks about the feminine structure and the masculine structure, sexual difference. And so those are his big 4. But the first time he really focuses on death drive is in Seminar 7, and he returns to it again in Seminar 11, and he does make some variations on it, make some modifications. But in Seminar 7, he formulates it like this. He says that death drive is a movement beyond the symbolic order. Well, this is what we've been saying here all along. It's a movement beyond law, beyond your social identity, beyond your being in the world, your social position, right? I mean, death drive wants to explode your specific identity or position in the world, right? Your identity in the world. And so death drive is a path the subject has to the real and what escapes the symbolic, right? So that's jargon, a lot of jargon, but the real, the way he talks about it, and there's a million different things we say about the real, and we've already talked about the registers, but think of it just like this. Like, you exist in a world, there's a certain identity that you have established or has been allotted for you, and yet there's all kinds of ways you could exist as a different person, right? Yet it's like death drive just wants out of your social position. It wants to, again, like if you're you're a musician and you've been a musician your whole life, there's some part of you that wants out of this position. Like, I want to be freed from this person I've become, this social identity I've established.
Right.
And this is what he means by symbolic suicide. This is the death that death drive is actually seeking. Not literal biological death, but symbolic death.
This is my chance to say that I am releasing a video in the next few days. It's a clip of the interview I did with Dr. Ian Thompson on Heidegger and death, and it's about existential death, which is not the same as, like, your body dying. And that, it's about existential world collapse. And so we don't really have to get too into it right now, but it's super related to this. I'll just say that because it's like
easily connected to what he means by symbolic death.
It's like the world of the carpenter. It includes like so much. Everyone sees you this way. Everything, your knowledge is all related to this. Like your entire relation to your workshop is in this. And if you go through, like, if your death drive were to kick in, like the way it would relate to existential world collapse, is that everything in that world is pretty much like either lost its value or has its fundamental meaning has shifted to where it's just like you either want to have nothing to do with it or and existential world collapse could also be like, you're a violin virtuoso and then your hand gets broken and you're not anymore, right? Like, yeah. And suddenly this whole world that you had like cultivated, is just gone, like
shattered.
Shattered. Except that so that would not necessarily be death drive, but but a lot of things that we see as like existential world collapse, death drive is usually going to play a role in that.
But here's the thing: it depends on where the death drive is focused. Because to destroy your social order, to destroy your world, is to destroy your symbolic position. Like, that's why Joker, right, in The Dark Knight, he's almost pure death drive, where it's like, I don't want any symbolic identity. I just want to just destroy to destroy. He gets enjoyment just from what he's doing. It doesn't serve any cause, right? He doesn't really have any lofty values he's trying to actually establish. It's Michael Caine, right? He says some men just want to watch the world burn, and that's the idea. Like, death drive wants to destabilize ourselves and the world for its own enjoyment. Like, it enjoys the very process of undermining them. But so yeah, there's ways to connect it to like existential death, but
yeah, there's the aside. I was looking for an opportunity to plug that video because it's
this follows it up, right? So Lacan, following in the footsteps of the Marquis de Sade, he associates death drive with the destruction of the world. Death drive seeks to destroy the world so as to start all over again. That is, to create a new world. Creation ex nihilo. Death drive is the urge to start everything from zero. So there's a whole chapter or a whole session of Seminar 7 that's called Creation ex nihilo, and it's right there with death drives, the death drive session, and that's the way Lacan at this point formulates death drive. It's this desire. Tom Waits is one of my favorite singers, and he's got a song, and it goes, I want to walk away and start all over again. Well, that really sums up death drive, right? Yeah. And it's like, I just want to start from zero. I want to start, but that's what's interesting, right, about what Lacan says. It is an impulse for destruction, but it wants to create once it's destroyed. So he also gives it this kind of creative aspect that you don't really see in Freud. And so this is one of his original contributions. But so death drive seeks symbolic death, not biological death. Symbolic death leads to the evacuation of the symbolic field, the world, the signifying chain, etc. A lot of terms there, but it's really just a way of, I want to like kill the society that operates within me. Like, I want to be freed from this. And that's a weird way, like evacuating the symbolic field, but it's just really a way of saying, I'm not going to live under the pressure or the confines of my social order. And death drive like wants to get all of those like social prohibitions, social laws, limitations, wants to blow all those apart.
And this world destruction, this is being used in the sense from being in time, right? This is the idea. This is there's
the world is symbolic order, basically.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And so death drive frees us from our socio-symbolic moorings, right? Our anchorings, and it frees us from our positions in the world. Symbolic death via death drive is a way of getting a fresh start. At any moment, we can make everything we value count as nothing to us. Now, I'm not saying it happens at the conscious level, but there's some part of us that can just go, all this shit that I think is so valuable, it's not valuable to me at all, right? I mean, again, to go back to Fight Club, that's what he does. He blows up his nice apartment filled with all the consumer products that society tells him he has to have in order to be happy. And once he goes and lives in an abandoned hellhole. But he enjoys it, right? It's freedom to him that he's destroyed his consumer goods. And he destroyed his pleasure. And by doing so, he's like destroyed his social status, his social position. And so he's found this immense enjoyment in the freedom he's gotten from committing a symbolic suicide. Not a literal suicide, but a symbolic suicide. And so there's actually immense freedom in it oftentimes. So,
would you say cigarettes or alcohol are somehow related to death drive?
Absolutely. So, yeah. I mean, all kinds of stuff we do. overeating, eating things like it's not even overeating. One of the basic
no, gluttony, straight up though, just cramming my face, eating way too much. Absolutely.
But no, you know what? I mean, this is why this is a great instance of jouissance, death drive. Americans, one of their baseline forms of death drive or enjoyment isn't just eating too much. That's part of it. But it's eating bad shit for the sake of it. You know, they want to eat fast food for the sake of it. And like in New York, remember where they were trying to limit like the size of the sodas you could buy?
Bloomberg, he did it. Everyone's like, he's a fascist.
Everybody fucking hated him for it.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing
that
is like
American death drive. That's American jouissance. Like, fuck you, asshole. Like, don't you ever make me give up doing what's bad for me because I enjoy it so fucking much.
A normie American sees Richard Spencer and goes, a fascist? I don't know about that. I don't know if that's really a fascist. We can't be so sure. You just call everyone you don't like a fascist. But then they turn around and call Bloomberg a fascist because he banned their large drink, you know.
My 64-ounce Coke from me out of my cold dead hand.
Yeah, exactly. Out of my cold dead
But
hand.
this is where you see, this is libidinal economy. This is all of a lot of this sounds so abstract, but the reason I like these theoretical tools more than a lot of them is it makes sense of all the shit you deal with in your everyday life in a way that a lot of philosophies, or he wouldn't call it philosophy, but the way that a lot of conceptual systems aren't able to. So, I mean, psychoanalysis really can help us understand why people are so mad about not being able to purchase, a 284, ounce Coke or whatever it was.
Right. And if it doesn't always explain the situation in a way where we now understand the situation, it can at least like free that situation up into a perspective to where you can see a variety of different like factors that can be at work, which like where people take cultural discourse at this superficial and explicit level, and they don't realize that there's people have their unconscious, like they have their desire, they have their libidinal investments. Habitus is not just like your behavior. Your habitus is like
libido.
It's you're shaped this way. This is the way that you found to cope. As Dr. Dreyfus would say.
And again, I didn't clarify. When in a Lacanian context, when you talk about libido, right? For Freud, it's sexual energy, but libido really more or less is used as a synonym for jouissance with Lacanians. Maybe they make some really detailed distinction there, but most of the time, libido is just another term for jouissance. And so, but no, this as well as I do, that if somehow like leftists were able to come to power in America and they really did occupy the positions of power, they said, hey, guess what we're going to do? We're going to give all Americans really great, fresh, healthy food. We're going to get rid of the bullshit chemicals, all the processed garbage, and we're going to have the best, fresh, healthiest food in the world. Americans would go, fuck you. And they would demand their McDonald's, they would demand their KFC. And this is just one of the aspects of it's weird. It's part of American identity. It's part of American ritual that people enjoy their fast food. And the idea, if they ever thought somebody was going to take these places from them, they would lose their shit. And at a conscious level, you could talk to them and they would agree, but they would still lose their shit. And that's why you start to see this shit at work and you're just like, my God, like everybody knows this shit is bad for them. And we do this thing like, oh, people eat there because they can't afford to eat good food. That's true of some people, definitely. But damn well if the day came where we were going to shut down all the fast food restaurants, it would be like fucking riots and shit over like, no, goddamn it, I will enjoy myself in the ways that me and my parents and my grandparents have enjoyed ourselves.
Yeah,
it's weird. Like eating bad fast food is one of the like real American rituals.
Well, you know, just a perfect example of how hard it is to change these kinds of habits in relations to desire is just think about how often people are trying out diets or thinking about trying out diets. That's just, it's just a perfect, this consumes us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's like, well, I mean, your habitus is not just a bunch of habits that you just develop. Like, no, like this is, it's also like a part of your libidinal economy. And these things are like, yeah, it's a lot more complex than just like what you're doing in the moment, which is why we have to talk about subjectivities instead of just like egos, because egos are just like subjective reports. But it's like, yeah,
Ego is just a part of our psyche or human condition or subject, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
Libidinal economies. So,
I am
okay,
objects
so
like that super.
here.
I am objects like said like that super cyan McNuggets lady. Did you ever see that? I don't know if I saw this one. I am object.
I've heard of it. I don't think I saw it though.
Okay, we need to see it because I don't know. But Nuo asked, "Is death drive phallic then, as in not being repressed?"
That's I mean, this is one of these things. Phallic. That
I know you don't like to talk about the phallus as much. Yeah.
Well, no, it's just because whenever Lacanians or even people who are into psychoanalysis, half the time when they use that term, I don't know what they mean because, I mean, I would need a definition. Like, okay, I don't see, like, it's phallic and not being repressed. I mean, I guess, but at the same, like, the imaginary phallus is what is repressed by the name of the Father. So, again, phallic is one of these terms that I've never found like what the consistent signified is when Lacanians are using it. If they want to give a definition, I'd love to, I could see what I'd come up with. But okay, I want to kind of get through this Lacan section here. Okay, so we often try to give ourselves justifications for our symbolic suicides, but in reality, they defy all rational explanations. An example Todd McGowan gives is from this old classic Western called 3:10 to Yuma, and it makes no sense that this guy would act the way he does at the end of the film, but he ends up making a decision that's going to probably lead to his actual death. And it's not like he did it out of any like moral sense of what's right and what's wrong. He just made this self-destructive act. And you could tell that he immensely enjoyed it, even though, and he tries to give it a little justification, but it doesn't really make sense of anything. So, these explanations don't make sense insofar as they are the rejection of our self-interest. Like, you can try to explain it away or give it a justification, but you're ultimately acting against what's in your self-interest, so they don't really make a whole lot of sense. And at least not according to conscious logic, right? And but the possibility of this symbolic suicide is always open to us. And so Lacan says in Seminar 7, the drive as such, insofar as it is then a destruction drive, has to be beyond the instinct to return to the state of equilibrium of the inanimate sphere. What he just said there, he's rejecting that idea in Freud that we want to return to our inanimate being, right? We want to literally kill ourselves, because if the drive gets off on destruction, then it wants to keep on destroying. Well, to continue destroying, you have to exist in some way. You don't want to literally die, and so it's his way of it's his way of saying, like, drive is not actually chasing some inanimate state. So he rejects that part of Freud. But then he says, will to destruction, will to make a fresh start. And that's just what we were talking about. Drive wants to collapse our symbolic identity so we can create a new one, which in turn it can destroy again. And then he says, Freud's thought in this matter requires that what is involved be articulated as a destruction drive, given that it challenges everything that exists, but it is also a will to create from zero, a will to begin again. And so we'll see how this has implications that we're going to flesh out in a minute. Then in seminar 11, Lacan returns to the concept of drive, but he really, and I said this at the very beginning when we started, there's death drive and then there's the drives. And there's 4 main drives that Lacan talks about. The oral drive, eyes, ears, mouth, and anus. So those are the 4 drives. And he says that every drive is a death drive. So in these 4 particular drives we have, death drive is always at work. And the thing is, to talk about the drives in their particularity, we'd have to do a whole nother lecture. So I'm not going to get into the particularity of the drives. But what he does in seminar 11, and this is something that huge for Zizek, he's always talking about this, is that he says drive follows a circular movement. That is, drive circles the object. Death drive is the way the subject inherently satisfies itself. Death drive is inherently satisfying for the subject. Death drive is not pleasurable, but it is satisfying or enjoyable, which means it produces jouissance. Death drive gets satisfaction, jouissance, by missing its object. Death drive involves the enjoyment of not attaining the object. So here's the point. This building up of excitation, this building up of jouissance, the reason you don't want to get the object you think you're aiming at is once you get it, it would reduce, like pleasure principle would kick in and it would reduce the buildup of the excitation, and that would neutralize precisely what the drive is trying to do. And so, okay, like I said, drive is this really specifically human thing, but a certain animal gives us a brilliant example or a brilliant image to go off of, right? It's the dog chasing its own tail. That's what drive is for us, right? The dog doesn't actually want to get the tail, because then the chase, the buildup would be over. The dog, and again, I'm not saying that this is actually death drive at work in a dog. It's just the dog chasing its own tail is a nice image of how drive works in us, where the last thing the dog would want is to get to actually bite his tail. And so for us, the last thing we want as far as drive goes is to actually get the thing we're pursuing. We want to keep on missing it, or like that's the dog going in a circle, right? That's the way it's like drive circles its object. And you'll hear Lacanians always talk like this, but it just means if you keep going around, if you keep circling this path, right, you never actually get your hands on the thing. And you just like, and think about even in old movies where 2 guys are about to fight, but instead of like going directly at each other, they like build this tension up by just walking around in a circle. And Lacan uses this idea of the circularity of the drive to say, like, drive just wants to continue not getting what it wants, because if it gets what it wants, it'll be satisfied, and then it will reduce jouissance, it will reduce excitation. So to continue to build excitation, it has to continue to not get what it's chasing.
So, okay, to me it's just confusing, because it's like, I don't know, if I just think of like the example of binging, it's like, no, I do want to get full. Like, I don't know, I want to get really full. So what's and then I do get really full after some
binging,
point, right?
Again, to overeat is totally against your self-interest. Like, that's the thing. When you actually overeat, when you binge, you eat to the point of it's a pleasure and pain. You know, it's jouissance. But you know, an example of this idea of you just want the stimulation or the excitation without the object. Think about babies with pacifiers, right? I mean, from a if we want to view, view it in terms of biological need, then the baby wants the milk from the breast, right? But this is Freud's early observation, is that the human baby is different than the puppy, right? Animals want the nourishing substance, and then when they get enough, they're done. Babies just want to suck the breast, not for the milk, but just to suck the breast. That's why babies will, they suck on pacifiers, because the oral drive wants that stimulation, and it's almost as if the milk like gets in the way, right? Because once you've had there's only so much you can eat, right? So you have to stop. but like the drive just wants to keep on going. And
but the drive is not the instinct, right? And so this is right where you're like, isn't it just instinctual just to want to suck on something at that age or something? Like,
you don't see animals repeat this. Like, what's instinctual is to get the. I mean, when you think of animals, right? Most animals actually eat enough to maintain a certain weight. You don't see animals have drastically different weights in their species, like overly overweight or underweight, right? They tend to eat a certain amount to maintain a certain weight that's optimal for their physicality. Well, humans don't do that, and there's psychoanalysis talks about anorexia and all this. Like, there's an enjoyment in not eating the food, right? And then you can also get immense enjoyment from overeating, and this has to do with drive, whereas the instinct or the biological need in animals seems to always be geared toward homeostasis, towards balance, right? And again, when you look at most species, unless they're in really unique circumstances, they all tend to seem to have the same kind of weight for their species. And it's as if like their biological makeup just keeps them in a kind of balance with their environment in a way that we just cannot maintain. And so that's the thing, is like whether it's the pacifier or it's sucking the thumb or whatever, that's like the oral drive, where it doesn't satisfy any biological need. There's really no point to it. It's the fact that these organs cease to be pure biological organs and they take on a life of their own. That's why psychoanalysis calls them partial objects, right? It's as if these things have a mind. I mean, in generic discourse, people talk about like how the penis has a mind of its own, but the mouth has a mind of its own, the eyes have a mind of their own, the ears have a mind of their own, the anus, and that's part of what drive theory gets at, is how these parts of our bodies really are their own kind of subjects. They're weird. They have a weird kind of fixation on stimulation for the sake of stimulation, and it doesn't meet any biological necessities. And in a lot of ways, like meeting the biological necessity can hamper the drive. It can get in the way of what it wants to do. And so that's what he means by drive wants to miss the object. It wants to not get what it wants, precisely so it can keep on stimulating itself, building up tension, building up excitation. And so then he goes on. So this is important, right? So what does psychoanalysis do when it comes to this, right? Okay, you have this drive, and it goes out of its way to self-sabotage. It goes out of its way to not have satisfaction, to keep on missing the object. Well, psychoanalysis seeks to shorten the circuit of the drive. The idea is that when you're doing this thing of like you're giving yourself too much trouble, you're making it too hard to reach pleasure or have satisfaction or whatever, when you're constantly doing this, they can take on these really elaborate ways. People will have these elaborate ways of giving themselves too much trouble. And what psychoanalysis does is try to shorten the circuit, which is to say, like, it tries to lessen how much trouble you give yourself. It's not saying it will ever get rid of drive. It won't. It's not saying that it can do away with, this impulse to, have jouissance. It won't. But what it can try to do is help you not sabotage yourself so extremely in this circular motion of the drive. So
did you look at the screen?
It's like it's trying to make the trouble you give yourself for the sake of your enjoyment less troublesome. It's trying to make it easier to enjoy. And so it's like making the drive work more, in a way that's smoother. And that's, so Lacan even says this in Seminar 11. He says, on the whole, and as a first approximation, I would say that to which they give satisfaction by the ways of displeasure is nevertheless, and this is commonly accepted, the law of pleasure. Now, again, he's using these terms in a way that's not yet, like, sometimes when he says pleasure, it's like he has jouissance in mind, and I know that's confusing, but he's trying to say that what you find in psychoanalysis is that the only way people get pleasure is by giving themselves displeasure, which is to say the only way they get jouissance is by sabotaging their self-interest, going against what's good for them, so on and so forth. And then he goes on, let us say that for this sort of satisfaction, jouissance, they give themselves too much trouble, up to a point, and it is this too much trouble that is the sole justification of our intervention. Our intervention is our intervention as psychoanalysts is to help them lessen how much trouble they give themselves for the sake of their enjoyment.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of the University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of the University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.